Welcome to today's Explainer. Okay, we're diving straight into one of the most incredible geographical detective mysteries out there. We're talking about a lost continent. And no, not some mythical Atlantis. A very real, absolutely massive prehistoric landmass that used to sit right beneath the cold, choppy waves of the North Sea. This was a thriving, bustling world that just vanished from the map. So, how exactly did it disappear? And honestly, how on earth did we even find it? Let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. The whole story actually kicks off on a really wet September night back in 1931. Picture this. A fishing trawler called the Collinda, skippered by a guy named Pilgrim E. Lockwood, is dragging its nets about 25 miles off the coast of England. They haul up their catch, and mixed with all the fish is this giant, heavy chunk of black compressed peat. Fishermen call it moorlog. Now, when Lockwood literally whacks it with a shovel to toss it overboard, he hits something hard. Embedded right inside that prehistoric mud was a beautifully carved, barbed antler point. It was a 13,000-year-old Maglemosian harpoon, a literal weapon used by Mesolithic hunters.
But wait, here's the massive puzzle. That net was dragged up from 120 feet below the ocean surface. Finding a human-made hunting weapon at that kind of depth, it seemed completely impossible. And when scientists actually analyzed the peat stuck to the harpoon, the pollen and the diatoms inside it were unmistakably fresh water. They were terrestrial. This was the very first piece of undeniable physical proof that this giant expanse of deep ocean was, at one point, completely dry, habitable land where human beings actually walked around, hunted, and lived their lives.
Today we know that submerged world as Doggerland, which gets its name from the Dogger Bank fishing grounds. For the longest time, scientists would casually just brush it off as a land bridge. But honestly, that term totally misses the point. Doggerland was definitely not just some temporary little crossing strip. It was a permanent, massive landscape spanning tens of thousands of square miles. It literally connected Great Britain to Scandinavia and mainland Europe, locking it all together into one giant continuous landmass.
And far from being some barren, frozen wasteland, Doggerland was frankly Europe's Mesolithic Garden of Eden. Seriously, once the glaciers retreated at the end of the last ice age, this entire area just exploded with life. Picture a sprawling landscape packed with dense oak, elm, and hazel woodlands. It was this vast, low plain, zigzagged by rivers, totally dotted with lakes and rich wetlands. And the wildlife. We're talking roaming woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant deer. Because of all these incredible, inexhaustible resources, it was pretty much the absolute best hunting and fishing ground in all of northwestern Europe for thousands of thriving hunter-gatherer communities.
So, for decades, we knew Doggerland was down there, but it was just so frustratingly inaccessible under all that murky North Sea water. But the real turning point? It happened when researchers took a massive leap of faith. Like Professor Vince Gaffney jokingly remembers, they went straight to the offshore oil and gas industry. Now, these petroleum companies had already spent hundreds of millions of dollars gathering insane amounts of 3D seismic reflection data to map the deep Earth crust for oil and gas traps. The archaeologists basically said, hey, can we borrow that incredibly expensive data to map the shallower, buried landscapes of the Holocene epoch?
And miraculously, the petroleum industry actually said yes. They shared their data, and it totally revolutionized archaeology. Through huge projects like Europe's Lost Frontiers, scientists used this exact seismic data to map out over 23,000 square kilometers of this lost world. And they didn't just find a flat, boring ocean floor, right? They mapped out buried meandering river channels, hidden hills, ancient salt marshes. They even found this enormous ancient estuary they ended up calling the Southern River. Then, and this is the crazy part, researchers actually sailed out to those specific computer-mapped coordinates, drilled down and extracted marine sediment cores to pull up ancient DNA and perfectly preserved environmental data straight from those prehistoric valleys.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how this high-tech mapping paid off with incredible physical proof. See, once they knew exactly where the ancient rivers and hills were hiding, they could pinpoint exactly where humans likely settled. When they pulled up that sediment from the Southern River estuary, they actually found a prehistoric stone hammerstone. And in nearby areas like the Brown Bank, trawlers ended up dredging up a 13,000-year-old aurochs bone that was engraved with this intricate zigzag pattern, which is quite possibly the oldest figurative art from that entire region. These artifacts proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that the computer-generated maps were dead on. These were actual, physical sites where Mesolithic humans lived and made tools.
But obviously, Doggerland is no longer with us today. So what actually happened? Well, for a long time, the prime suspect was this incredibly violent, sudden catastrophe called the Sturgeslide. About 8,150 years ago, a massive chunk of the continental slope off the coast of Norway, which was totally loaded down with tens of thousands of years of glacial debris, just completely collapsed. This underwater landslide displaced a mind-boggling amount of rock and mud, which triggered a mega tsunami. Within minutes, these terrifying waves, which experts estimated were up to 20 meters high in some spots, came ripping across the North Sea straight toward Doggerland.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how modern science is totally rewriting that apocalyptic narrative. The old theory just kind of assumed that the Sturgis tsunami completely obliterated Doggerland and everyone on it in a single catastrophic afternoon. But sedimentary ancient DNA, or SEDA DNA, published in March 2026 from the Lost Frontiers Project, dropped a massive plot twist. The DNA pulled from those sediment cores proves that temperate woodland species, things like oak, elm, and hazel, actually survived the tsunami. The floodwaters eventually rolled back, the land recovered, and parts of southern Doggerland actually stuck around above water for another 1,000 years.
So, if the mega tsunami didn't kill Doggerland, what finally did? Well, the true killer was much, much slower and infinitely more relentless. It was an inexorable sea level rise caused by the melting of the ice caps. As global temperatures warmed up throughout the Holocene, the ocean just kept creeping up by a few millimeters a year. While that Sturgis tsunami was no doubt a devastating, highly traumatic event in the region's history, the ultimate drowning of Doggerland was really a 10,000-year story of a slowly but unstoppably rising ocean.
Let's move to and see how this builds across the timeline. You can really see how this slow-motion disaster unfolded over millennia. Back at the last glacial maximum, 18,000 years ago, sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than today, and Doggerland was a vast, completely connected continent. But as the ice melted and the sea kept rising, the water just kept eating away at the landmass from the north and the south. By 8,300 years ago, which is right before that Storego wave hit, the landscape had already fractured into this broken-up archipelago of low-lying islands like Dogger Island. And finally, by about 7,000 years ago, the rising waters swallowed up the very last islands, submerging the whole landscape to pretty much modern levels.
Which brings us to a super fascinating and honestly pretty urgent modern paradox. As researchers from Europe's Lost Frontiers are quick to point out, we are currently in this massive race to combat contemporary climate change, right? To do that, we're rushing to build out green energy solutions, and the North Sea happens to be prime real estate for it. But here's the catch. This rapid modern development is happening in the exact same spot where the prehistoric landscape of Doggerland is lying perfectly preserved in that oxygen-free mud.
So the crucial point here is that our fight against future climate change is actually actively threatening the greatest archive we have of past climate change. Over the next couple of decades, the southern North Sea is going to be heavily developed with massive offshore wind farms. And the vast network of cables they need to lay across the seafloor, it risks slicing right through and irreparably damaging these completely untouched Mesolithic settlements before our archaeologists can ever even reach them. It really highlights this urgent need for wind farm developers and archaeologists to work together, making sure we can build our green energy without blindly destroying this completely unique piece of prehistoric heritage. So, we leave off with this thought-provoking question. What can we learn from a civilization forced to slowly abandon their homeland to the rising sea? Doggerland really isn't just some quirky archaeological curiosity. It is quite literally the closest geological analog we have to our own modern predicament. Millennia ago, entire communities of people watched their coastlines vanish, their hunting grounds flood, and their continent slowly drown beneath the rising sea, turning them into prehistoric climate refugees. As we face our own modern battle with rising oceans today, understanding exactly how the people of Doggerland adapted and ultimately lost, their world might just be the most important history lesson the Earth has kept hidden from us. Thank you so much for joining this explainer, and keep exploring.